Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our lucky 13th episode, appropriate for the month of October, of the objectively best podcast in all of human history, Armchair ESG with Nate and Yates. I'm Rob Yates, Director of Communications for OWL ESG. With me, as always, my partner in crime, Nate Najara. How you doing today, Nate?
Doing great. How are you, Rob?
I am doing fantastic. I'm make fun of me if you want. I'm one of those nerds. I love pumpkin spice. I love the fall. I love the leaves. I love the crisp air. I love grilling out outside. Um, I had a pumpkin spice latte this morning, and I
Nice.
apologize to no one.
Well, I live in Texas, so our fall comes a little later. So I'm about
Your
a few
fall, your
weeks.
fall is summer.
I'm a few weeks away from pumpkin spice, but I like the tie. Who's on your tie today?
This is the
Oh,
thinking.
very nice.
Ah,
I went through a phase of buying a bunch of ties. Worked at a bank, needed to maintain some personality, so
Got it.
I've got the Scream, I've got some Dolly, I've got a bunch, and then we stopped going to the office and wearing dress clothes. But I had to class it up, especially today, and set some standards, pun intended, because our guest, who coincidentally also comes from an area where the weather stays nice. So we got Charlotte, North Carolina, just outside of Dallas, Texas, and LA, a frequent collaborator, the source of our excellent blog, one of the greatest support people you could imagine having, who has helped out in a whole bunch of stuff and has now written the perhaps first and only comprehensive documentation of the different regulatory standards in ESG reporting around the world. Terry Geske. Terry, how are we today?
nice to be here.
Oh, we're happy to have you. So, as I mentioned, you did, and the link will be in the description box. I'm going to put it up on the screen here. We have now published, authored by you, just an incredibly comprehensive look at the major and semi-major regulatory regimes around ESG reporting globally. So first, I want to hear about what it took to do this. What was your methodology? What was your timing?
I think speaking for myself, over the years, I've become familiar in bits and pieces with the different disclosure requirements in different places as news bubbled up about how they were being formalized or adopted or what have you. But I really never had an opportunity to compare and contrast or put them all together. And so when we talked about doing this project, I just started to think what would be the most logical way to approach this. And pretty soon became clear that geographically made the most sense. And there are differences across different parts of the world in terms of the pace of adoption, the stage at which countries are in terms of adopting standards, and the extent to which they are very detailed versus very broad. So I just took a geographic approach, and then I realized, oh yes, there are things that are supranational, if you will, entities that are attempting to set standards that could be adopted across all countries. So that became the entry point. Talked about those first.
So I know something you and I have talked about just in detail at points is how having a consistent, reliable reporting standard so that investors know what they're looking at is such a big thing. My question to you is, how much do you see that coming to fruition, and where do you see it not? So like, I mean, I know they're getting better about it, but we have the international reporting standards and generally accepted reporting standards in accounting. Is there a lot of that in the ESG space?
So that's actually where I like to start in talking to people who don't know much about this. Is imagine a world where there were no accounting standards. And in fact, I used to teach corporate finance, and I would teach my students, imagine as an investor, if you were being asked to put money, buy stock in or buy bonds from an issuer and you had no financial reporting from them, you wouldn't feel very confident about doing that. In fact, you probably wouldn't. And so then take it a step further and say, okay, let's assume that there is some vague standard that you have to disclose financial information, but there really aren't definitions about when you can book revenue or what account receivables really are or how you define current liabilities. You couldn't compare one company to another. It would be almost impossible for you to make any sort of peer group comparisons or relative value analysis. So that's kind of where we've been for a long time with these, sustainability or ESG disclosures. And I would argue to those who think that this is just, making more work for people in corporations to have to adhere to these disclosure standards, this really is economically material. And so if you don't have this information, investors are stuck with guessing about the risks that a company faces with respect to climate change or anything else. So I think we are still very early days as far as arriving at some generally accepted accounting principles or internationally accepted standards. There is some movement in that direction. The ISSB, which is the International Sustainable Standards Bureau, and there's so many acronyms here, it's just going to come tumbling out.
Which,
The
if I could interrupt real
ISSB,
quick, you do a good
sure.
job of glossarying all those in this document. So
Thank you. Probably more to come, but thank you for that. So there is the ISSB adopted some framework or standards or approach from what's called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So there is some movement, and then the UK adopted that, but it's still early days.
and I guess that probably goes across the board. So it's early days in disclosure, but it's early days in figuring some of this stuff out too. We're not at ground floor
Absolutely.
anymore, but the foundation's there. We're really building whatever it's going to look like now. So it kind of makes sense that the whole regime is coming together.
Yeah, it does. And I also like to say that for people who claim it's too difficult to measure this, or it's too squishy or vague or amorphous to measure this other thing, just because something is difficult doesn't mean you don't try. And as you try, you'll figure out what didn't work well and how to make it better. Just like when you try to stand on one leg and you lose your balance, you learn from that, how can you do it differently so that you can balance better. So yeah, is it hard to measure scope 3 emissions? Yes. Does that mean we shouldn't try? No. So, but we're still sort of, I don't want to say stumbling in the dark, but we're just kind of early innings.
Yeah,
Still.
I have a follow-up question to
Yeah,
that.
go ahead.
So do you think, in your opinion, there needs to be a bit more pain when it comes to environmental social governance knock-on effects for not measuring that type of stuff? So I come from the KYC, AML regulatory background, right? Know your customer, anti-money laundering. And sometimes there has to be more pain. There just has to be this enough big flash points to go, whoa, we need to get ahead of this. We need to figure out how to standardize this. And I know we'll get to Europe here later on, but it's always curious that they're a step ahead, but maybe they're just feeling more pain than we're feeling from the results of GHG emissions and changing climate and things like that. So I don't know if you have any thoughts around that.
Interesting. As far as feeling pain, my thoughts were headed more in terms of penalties, legal fines, or just investor backlash. I think because climate change is a global phenomenon, where even though Europe has felt a lot of pain because of, their rapid shift to finding other energy sources aside from, Russian oil and gas, I like to think that the pain comes from pressure from investors. And what's interesting is that even though one could argue that the US is kind of behind the curve as far as imposing disclosure standards, 100% of S&P 500 companies publish corporate social responsibility reports, 100%. And something like 70%, I can't remember off the top of my head, of Russell 1000 companies publish these disclosures. So they're under pressure to do this. And they are, something that they're publishing. So I don't think they can just make it up and lie. So I think that the pain comes from pressure. If you're not doing it and everyone else is, it doesn't look so good.
I mean, that kind of makes sense. The market's already adjusted, and especially in the US, it does feel like the regulators are playing a little bit of catch up. Can you speak to that more? What's been going on in the US? What's to come? What's happening right now?
Yeah, there's been a couple things pretty recently in the US. First of all, the SEC has proposed that companies be required to publish information about their climate change related risks. And that, interestingly, would include scope 3 emissions. So there's scope 1, 2, and 3. There's also scope 4, but we'll leave that aside. Scope 1 and 2 emissions are emissions for which a company is directly responsible in terms of the energy they use for their operations. And that could either be energy that they buy from a utility, the electricity that they use to power their factory, or it could be, fuel that they burn in their manufacturing process. It's all stuff for which they're directly responsible. Scope 3 emissions, on the other hand, are those for which a company is indirectly responsible, either through their supply chain. So if they ship stuff from China to the Port of Long Beach here in Los Angeles, they are responsible for the emissions that come from that shipping. Scope 3 also includes, and this I think is the toughest part, what the customers who buy your products, the emissions that result from their use of your products. So if you manufacture cars, then you, Ford or GM or Toyota, whomever, would be responsible for my driving around and the emissions that I create. And that companies push back on a lot in terms of saying, how can I measure what my customers generate? Well, you can make some reasonable assumptions. We can say the average person drives this much and pollutes this much. And, we know that electric vehicles, that would be 0. So scope 3 emissions are probably about 80% of emissions that companies are responsible for. So to ignore them is kind of giving people a free pass, I think. So I think we should, I applaud the SEC in terms of saying we need to include scope 3 if they are material for a company, and they're material for most companies.
I think what's interesting about the inclusion of the scope 3 is that when you look at reductions in emissions, then you can trace them back, and there's a baseline number from which you can subtract. So
Yeah,
even if you're off on your assumptions, if everyone's sort of equally off on their assumptions, but we're really measuring reductions, you actually get some useful information.
exactly. Right. If we're all making errors in the same direction,
Yeah.
that is still useful information. The other thing the US has just done recently, which I think highlights a really important thing about this whole what are the standards issue, the SEC has increased the definitions that it's looking at with respect to what it calls the names rule. And the names rule for the SEC is if you have a fund, a mutual fund, say, and its name is the value fund or the growth fund or the small cap fund or whatever, you actually have to have, I think it's 80% of your holdings match that description. You can't call yourself a growth fund if you hold mostly value stocks. You can't call yourself a small cap fund if you hold mostly large cap. Well, this is now being expanded to sustainability. So you can't call yourself, if this is adopted, which I think it probably will, you can't call yourself a green fund or a sustainable fund or a earth-friendly fund or whatever, unless you can show that actually the contents of the fund meet that description. And that's anti-greenwashing.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And I think that, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say it's a response to the greenwashing that's going on.
Sure. And then that's really important. Again, it gets at the SEC's remit, which is to protect investors. And if fund managers are greenwashing, then investors aren't being protected. But it does kind of remind us that when it comes to disclosures, there are disclosures for the corporations themselves, and there are disclosures for the financial products. And those are really two different things.
Yeah, it makes a big difference. And it makes a big difference because if you're not a sophisticated investor, you might not be aware of that.
Exactly. So you might also kind of get all excited and say, oh, companies are having to disclose their this, that, and the other thing. But if the fund managers get to ignore it, then it doesn't really help me as an investor unless I'm buying, individual stocks.
So we talked
Go
about
ahead.
the US. Oh, do you have something?
No, go ahead, Remy.
Oh, so we talked about the US, and I do want to come back to it because the US has been a fascinating story across the board. But you mentioned the EU. They have, to say they have the most comprehensive reporting standard is, it's almost unfair because it puts the others in the same category. What did you notice when you were looking at the way the EU requires ESG reporting?
Well, comprehensive is a very good way to describe it. The Nordic countries and the Netherlands in particular have really been at the vanguard of the whole sustainable investing movement. And so it's not surprising that the EU has taken the lead on this, but I do think that it's laudable, it's admirable that all of the countries in the EU seem to be really on board with this. I first had gotten very confused about the different disclosure requirements in the EU and how it all fit together. So going through this writing process helped me. And now I think of it as a three-legged stool rather. The three components are the SFDR, which is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Requirements. Again, more acronyms. So there's the SFDR, there's the EU taxonomy, and then there's the most recent part of it, which is the Corporate Social Responsibility Disclosures, the CSRD. And at first I thought, why do they have to have all these different things and what's going on here? And now what I realize is that the SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Requirements, was for those fund managers. It's saying if you are going to call yourself an impact fund or a sustainable fund, and for those who are familiar with the terms, that's Article 9 and Article 8, if you're going to label yourself that way, you have to prove to your investors that you are really doing what you say you're doing as far as your investing. However, if you don't have information from the corporations that you're investing in that allow you to demonstrate, hey, these are good, green companies, or they have good social, socially responsible policies. If you're not getting those disclosures from the company, it's kind of hard to prove to your investors that you're investing the way you say you are. So that's where the CSRD comes in. So great, now you have fund managers who are required to disclose certain things if they're going to call their funds, Article 8 or Article 9 or sustainable or impact. And you have requirements for corporations to disclose things. But what if we don't agree on what's green? What if, Bob, you think that nuclear and
I was going to say nuclear is the
nuclear is
key example, and even the PRI can't agree on that.
And nuclear and natural gas were a big issue, and that's where the EU taxonomy comes in. The EU taxonomy says this is defined as sustainable or green, and this isn't. And I think that that's really important, because even if you're not attempting to greenwash, you can simply have an honest difference of opinion. And if you had an honest difference of opinion between, Spain and France and Germany and the Netherlands as to whether or not something qualified as sustainable, then investors still are kind of not in a good place. So that's what the EU taxonomy does. And, I'm oversimplifying, but it does say you can call this green and you can't call that green. It turns out that natural gas and nuclear, after much fighting and brawling and
Especially
bloody
nuclear
fists, made it into the sustainable category. So, and anyway, sort of summing it all up, the SFDR and the EU taxonomy and the corporate social responsibility disclosure requirements all work together, so that if you're an investor in the EU and you're a corporation in the EU, you kind of know what you need to do, and it's kind of makes sense.
Let me ask you this, and I certainly work with these too, so I mean, way better than I do, but I follow them, I get them. But do you think that there's any place where they're too complicated? Like, is there room for simplification anywhere? And I'm particularly interested in, like, from an aspect of uptake, because there's always going to be people that follow and just absorb, and it's right there. But for others who are pressed for time, like, is there room for improvement there?
I think there probably is always room for
Yeah, that's
improvement.
fair.
I couldn't say that I'm an I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on the details, but I do know that there were a lot of, smart people in a room hashing this out, and there's always going to be amendments and refinements. I'd be surprised if there weren't. Uh, as far as uptake is concerned, first of all, I think there are far fewer publicly traded companies in the EU than in the US. So uh, I think kind of the group pressure will work pretty well. The other thing that raises is that if you are a multinational, if you do a significant amount of business in the EU, you're going to have to adhere to those standards. So if you're a US based corporation, if you're Microsoft or Procter and Gamble or whoever, and you sell a lot into Europe, you're going to have to do that too. I guess getting back to your question, probably too detailed. I'm not I don't have a PhD in these things. I only maybe have a bachelor's degree in understanding these, I'm working on my master's, so I'll let you know.
Well, that you got to my follow-up question, which is going to be, if you are, particularly for companies that do business in more than one geographic location with a different regulatory regime around it, what are the big similarities that they'll find easy, and what are the differences they have to address?
Yeah, that's, I think, where the multinational or supranational bodies
IFRS.
come in, the ISSB, the TCFD, and sort of the one that started it all, well, maybe started all, the GRI, that Global Reporting Initiative, tried to say, hey, instead of everybody coming up with their own, let's come up with something that could be used by everyone everywhere. And not everybody likes to do that. A lot of times people like to come up with their own flavor of things, but I do think, as I think I mentioned earlier, the UK pretty much adopted the TCFD in terms of their climate disclosure requirements. And I think that's a very positive sign. And I am hoping that other countries, smaller countries, emerging market countries, will follow that lead and say, we really don't have to come up with one of our own. And if 50% of countries eventually adopt, say, the ISSB, then I would imagine there would be movement toward that. I just think the EU said, we're not going to wait around for this slow process to get through. We're going to just barge ahead.
Yeah, and on that
Yeah.
point, sorry to interrupt, Rob. On that point, I mean, in the document I read, talk about Singapore, because I think Singapore is trying to follow the lead
Yeah.
of the EU and the UK, and saying, listen, we don't want to reinvent the wheel here. Let's just go see what these guys have done and see how we can, move ahead quickly. Can you talk to that? Is that true? Is that what you're seeing? It's kind of what I'm reading, but I'm not really an expert in what Singapore is doing, but I just thought that was an interesting example when you said that the UK just adopted this and moved forward. So
sure. And again, I don't have a PhD in this, but I did, through my research, I was expecting, maybe this is showing sort of a US centric developed market snobbery. I thought, the emerging markets are not going to be doing anything but following someone else's lead. And, it was kind of interesting and rather, a positive sign. I think that Singapore actually also has jumped into this and said, we need to protect investors. And maybe, because Singapore has been something of a financial center and is probably attempting to expand its influence in that region as, Hong Kong becomes a little dicier.
China-fied.
I think that, pardon?
China-fied.
Yeah, China fine. Okay, I'll leave. Yeah, you can say that. I was
I
trying to be
live there.
diplomatic.
I love
I was
Hong
trying to be
Kong.
diplomatic.
Hong Kong is in my blood. I love that city, and I hate the national security law. I hate to see what's happening to it.
Yeah, it's really. I moved to Hong Kong many years ago, uh, but I think Singapore's move to say, hey, we're going to move to protect investors, and they really were focused on guidelines for asset managers, banks, and insurers that coming out and saying this is important. It does, I think, set the tone for other emerging markets that want to attract investors. They want to attract capital. They want to be seen as, places where investors who care about this will be safe.
Yep.
But yeah, there's no reason for them to come up with their own. Interestingly, on that point, Japan is kind of the opposite side. They don't really have any specific regulations. I'm actually planning a trip to Japan shortly, my second
Nice, very
time
nice.
there. And maybe it's because it's very clean in Japan. I'm just kidding. You could eat off the sidewalks.
Yep.
But, Japan does have problems as far as they don't really have good sources of power in terms of oil or gas reserves or coal. So they actually are turning back to nuclear, Rob, as I'm sure you're aware. But Japan doesn't really have any hard laws about sustainability disclosures yet, although they are looking at it. So I don't like to say they're playing catch up, but they're kind of playing catch up.
Well, Japan has always been an interesting market in terms of overall corporate governance because it's, for all the influence that the Japanese market has on the rest of the world, it's a fairly self-contained market. Like what happens in Japan is in Japan. They were also late adopters for a lot of things regarding director independence, audit committee independence, director tenure. I think with Japan, there's a little bit of a if it ain't broke, don't fix it attitude. And sometimes it waits too long. Like the signs were there that it's broke, but it was easy to push off. And this isn't, I mean, that's a broad generalization. There's some really innovative companies and certainly some market leaders there, but just in terms of market impetus, because I've seen that with some other things in Japan.
And I would agree, but in Japan's defense, I don't think they're turning a blind eye to this or sort of saying, oh, it's not happening. I think maybe culturally, what they're saying is we don't want to be prescriptive. We just want to say,
Okay.
do what's appropriate. Do what's appropriate to address these sustainability issues. Do what's appropriate to address human rights issues. And then maybe again, culturally, they just assume that people know what that means, that they know what appropriate means. There was one interesting thing I found this to be quite interesting is that for the draft disclosures that have been introduced in Japan, they are going to require companies, if it's adopted, to disclose gender pay gaps and the ratio of women in managerial positions. And also one other thing about childcare and male workers. And, Japan has a difficult problem as far as labor force participation of women. And so maybe this is a recognition that a little bit of, peer pressure will help to improve labor force participation by women if everybody has to disclose gender pay gaps and things like that.
That's very interesting. Yep. Never thought about that way. Yep. So in Japan, it's almost their philosophy is do the right thing, right?
Yeah.
They assume everybody knows what the right thing is. Yeah, that's very interesting.
When I was there some years ago, pre-pandemic, and there were so many people on the subways, on the trains, wearing masks. And it was just something they did more out of respect for others, to protect others. And my son, who was younger at the time and didn't have as good manners as I had hoped, an older woman got on the train, and he didn't stand up to give her his seat. And some other woman kind of glared at him and made a motion to stand up, which
No,
even
yeah,
I was like, okay, after I, elbowed him very harshly.
yeah,
And
I
I
think he's
think
right. Yeah.
it's cultural.
It is. It is. I will never forget flying through Japan with my family, two kiddos, one in a stroller. We land in Tokyo, and you know how they give you the gate side stroller, they take it from you before you board. So we're just waiting for the stroller to come up. So we're standing by the door waiting to deplane. And it took a while. So as the crew was getting off, from the flight attendants all the way to the captain, they just lined up on the jet bridge and they wouldn't leave until we got our stroller. And I even looked at them and said, "Oh, you can go. We'll wait. Or, it's no big deal." Like, nope, we are not deplaning. We're not getting off until you. And we got the stroller. They let us walk past, and then they all deplaned together. And I thought, I have never seen anything like that anywhere
Exactly.
in the world in my life.
Exactly. I think it's something that I really love about Japan, and maybe it will work. It's when they say disclose what's appropriate.
Yep.
Maybe it work. Maybe
Yeah.
it will work, but it wouldn't work here.
Yeah.
Sorry to
Yeah.
say.
Oh yeah. Here they're like, "See ya. I'm off the clock. I'm out." So yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to digress there, Rob, but
No, it's because obviously there's going to be cultural influences on how these are uptaken, and culture is huge in business in a lot of parts of the world. Violate business norms in some places and you're not getting deals done. And so that certainly spreads across both the regulatory regimes and the willingness of market participants to not just, I mean, if it's regulatory, you have to just sort of adopt it, but how much they're going to wholeheartedly adopt it and get into the spirit of it as opposed to just meaning the letter of it. I think I mentioned on last week's podcast or 2 weeks ago, one of the things that just cracks me up. So in India, they passed a rule. This was, I want to say 2012, maybe 2011, but that there had to be at least one woman on every corporate board of companies of a certain size. The day after the rule was passed, something like 1,100 executive chairmen's wives joined the boards of major companies. So you can meet the letter and not the spirit.
And not the spirit, right?
So staying on that side of the world, what about Australia and New Zealand? They're always interesting markets because they have very specific types of industries that stand out, and a lot of those are extractive.
Yes. Well, Australia is just in the process of finalizing some mandatory disclosures, and they do look to align with the ISSB, particularly with respect to climate-related risks. And given that so much of what goes on in Australia is extractive, it's not like one company is going to be at a terrible disadvantage relative to another. And I think that investors are sophisticated enough with respect to ESG issues now to realize you have to do sector specific comparisons. It just doesn't make sense to compare a mining company to a high tech company, leaving aside how much power and water the artificial intelligence algorithms use. But mining companies should have to disclose their impact on the environment, because to me, that's the key to innovation. And innovation is the way we're going to get out of this mess, if we are going to get out of this mess. And, the jury's still out on that. But if mining companies disclose this, and innovative entrepreneurial people within mining companies and outside of them say, hey, I think I have an idea about how to make that better, then, we're off and running. But if we don't publish it and everybody pretends it isn't happening and does the ostrich move and sticks their head in the sand, we're definitely doomed. So the best disinfectant is sunlight, right?
Yes, definitely. Well, that's actually an awesome segue into my next question. Without sunlight, you lack that disinfectant. So what do you see in terms of data quality that companies are reporting, that investors are getting?
So I'm going to sort of answer that, if I could, in a roundabout way.
Of course.
A blog that I recently wrote for OWL talked about ESG audits. And all of these disclosures are great, but if it turns out in the most, Machiavellian, nefarious way, it's just somebody in the accounting department making up numbers, then these disclosures don't really help. So we need to have, in my opinion, some type of audits, and that's starting to become a thing. ESG audits are becoming a thing. And so that is going to, shine a lot of sunlight, if you will, on ESG data problems. And I don't know. I mean, you guys both are as well qualified as I am to talk about the challenges of just even defining some of these things. How do you define carbon intensity? Well, you could say it's emissions as a percent of sales. Well, okay, that means you have some really different scalings, the different denominator base effects for companies that have high ticket items, but low profitability. You make 5 cents per item instead of $5,000 per item. If you divide by total assets, you have asset intensive companies and you have companies that don't have that, asset intensity. So just coming up with something that looks on the surface to be pretty simple, which is carbon intensity, it's hard to come up with these appropriate metrics. And the data is, what if you have a subsidiary in country A that measures it differently than the subsidiary in country B, and you try to combine them and you just end up with a mishmash? I don't know. I'll throw the question back to you guys.
That's a good question. And what we do at OWL is we try to, normalize the data as best we can. But even from the disclosure documents that seem pretty straightforward, like I said, GHG emissions, what we try to do is normalize it and then present to our users how we got, using our guidance, how we got to that data point. So at least in our data, you can see, hey, this is how OWL is taking the data and using our internal methodology to get to that number. So that's one way to do it. Also, what we're doing is we're providing a new platform for our clients to not only see that data in a structured way in a software platform, but allow them to add additional data points for data that might be out there in a slightly different way or in a category we don't necessarily cover. So they can bring that data into the system and attach supporting documentation there. So it gives people more color. And that's, with the thought process of, hey, maybe we're dealing in a different jurisdiction, or maybe we just want to add some more color commentary to this data point to say, well, there's maybe 3 sub data points that we want to add that's, that's associated, and here's the way. So the way we look at it is, yeah, it's a complicated problem, but what we want to do is give our clients a standard, range of data point subtopics, as we call them, that are pretty, you can find them in disclosures, but also give our clients the ability to flex and to add information that they're seeing in whether they're public disclosures or internal documentation. So yeah, if one day, you have a stakeholder come through the door and you can show them, well, here's our scope 1, but then here's, some other data to help support, the analysis we've done in that company. So I think because of this global, the global, I don't want to call it fracturing, but just not a global cohesion, that we need to be able to be flexible for our clients. And hopefully over time, I just read that the GRI started in 1997, right? So it's been around for a while, but, I think as people start, coming together and agreeing on things, and I really like what you said about sector. You do have to look at, the sector differences. That makes a huge deal. We're going to start to account for that. We already account for it, but we're going to start to allow our clients to move things into sectors that make sense for them and gather that data that way, and then do peer comparisons that way. So yeah, it's a great question. We're thinking about it. We're trying to lead the way on how to deal with that and allow our clients to have some flexibility in how they absorb that information. So.
Yeah, I obviously have a bias, but I think that OWL does an outstanding job of really paying attention to these differences in terms of data sources. And it is a tough problem. But as long as you're making a concerted effort to address it, I think you just have to accept that it's imperfect, and keep pressuring, whether it's OWL, a data provider, or corporations as the ultimate sources, to do better and give constructive examples of what better looks like. It's
Yeah,
it's
a big part. Yeah, a big part of that is transparency, right? Like in anything.
Absolutely.
Corruption it's just transparency. Is where did you get the information? And then if you didn't find the information, just say you didn't find the information.
That's right.
Not finding the information is
information.
And so that's part of what we're trying to tell the market. So
yeah, absolutely. If it isn't there, tell me it isn't there. Don't lie to
me.
Yeah.
There might be something that's tangential to it that you could add and say, that's not it, but you can add this data point and say, well, that's not it, but here's another one that might be useful down the road, and we want to keep track of it. So we know that things are going to move and shift. So a really quick question: what about the U.S. landscape? I mean, what are the headwinds? I mean, there's a lot of backlash with ESG over the last few years. Rob and I talk a lot about it. Stop politicizing this. Let's get the adults in the room and try to come up with a solution. So any thoughts about the headwinds in the United States and some of the non-obvious hurdles that might be in our way over the next few years as we try to get more standard frameworks around regulatory disclosure?
I think it's so deeply politicized. Unfortunately, I'm not optimistic that our elected officials are going to take the bull by the horns. I know even at the SEC with Chairman Gary Gensler has gotten a lot of people upset for introducing so many new rules in such a short period of time, that I think there's a good chance that in some states people will just say, oh, it's just another rule. We have to push back against this just because it's another rule, without even stopping to look at it and see if it makes sense or not. It's a rule. I don't like it. It's going to make more work for companies. I don't like it. But again, I get back to the peer pressure notion. With every other company in every other country having to make these disclosures, investors are going to say, look, I gotta know. I have to, people are being flooded out of their homes. They're being, supply chains are being disrupted. I have to know what the risks are for this company before I can invest. So, I just think it's inevitable.
And I think
go ahead.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt. Finish your thought.
No. I'm good.
I was going to say, and even some of that is, we were getting flooded out of our homes, but some of the podcasts, we did a podcast a couple of weeks ago about legislation and about young people suing states and suing governments.
Yes. In Montana. Montana's not exactly a blue state. Yeah.
No. I think I heard something in Europe somewhere they're suing 12 governments. Maybe Tessa can look that up for the show notes. And I thought, even if it's not, the generations that are upcoming are going to take a different view on this. And so I think they may be the one to really push it and supercharge it. So, maybe that's, when I think about legislation, I think you want robust data. You want accurate data as you can when you're moving into that space. In order to say, no, we've disclosed this information and it's been out there for years, or whatnot. But any thoughts around that with the younger generation and legislation? I thought, wow, this is pretty interesting. So,
well, I absolutely agree. And I know even amongst younger people who view themselves as conservative, Republican or what have you, climate change is outside of politics for them. They know that the world that they are living in is changing to the point where a lot of them are saying they're not going to have children. So I think that they are really taking this very seriously. And a shout out to my native state. And yes, I am a California native. California is just saying we're passing our own regulations. And, we often lead the way out here in terms of imposing environmental standards. And so we're going to require companies that do business in California to disclose their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions starting in 2026. It's going to be based on 2025 data, so companies have some time to get their ducks in a row. But if you are a company of any decent size and you do business here in the 5th largest economy in the world, you're going to have to disclose.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
Well, along those lines, one final question, because we're coming up on an hour here. What's next in the US?
What's next in the US?
So there's some context for the question, because you sent a draft for this and 2 days later you were like, wait a second, the draft changed. So what do we, I mean, we have draft rules out now. We're expecting a final rule, what, this month, next month? I mean, real soon for the 2025 disclosure, if I remember correctly. And then there's a little bit more that's going to change over the next couple months, potentially. I might have those dates wrong.
The adopting these rules should happen pretty quickly. That doesn't mean there won't be pushback. And by quickly, I mean, within the next 6 months, there will be pushback, I expect. And the TCFD, we talked about that early on, the Task Force on Climate related financial disclosures. There's also the TNFD, which is coming into force now, which is the Task Force on Nature related financial disclosures. That's not just the US, that's something that's
supernatural.
Yes, exactly. But I think that there's going to be the potential for these things to be unwound depending upon which political party is in charge. And, we've seen that happen. I think that there's probably going to be some of this tug of war for a while, but ultimately, as I said, the handwriting's on the wall. You're not going to be able to get away from this, nor should you want to, because it is all based on financial materiality. And that's the thing I always try to emphasize to people, is this is not tree hugging. I mean, if you want to hug a tree, hug a tree. I love trees. I was just hiking in Mammoth last weekend. If you want to be a climate activist, that's great. Be a climate activist. But this is about financial materiality. And I think that's what, cooler heads need to keep emphasizing.
And follow the market. I mean, the market's signaled pretty strongly what it thinks about this. Corporate pushback is, I mean, there, when there's a conversation at the table, sure, you want every voice to be represented, because you don't want draconian restrictions that are actually going to have financial implication. But investors want this. Corporations would be well placed to join the discussion, not try to prevent it.
Right. Yep. And going to, extremes by saying, oh, you want to shut down all oil drilling tomorrow. That's just posturing. Nobody's saying that.
Yep.
Nobody with influence, at least.
Nobody, I mean, right. Nobody, well said. Yeah. Nobody with influence.
Yeah, we talk a lot about that because, it's so funny, in my past life under AML KYC, you get to, you're looking at preventing money moving between parties that are engaged in like slave labor or bonded labor or human trafficking, and nobody's pushing back on that, right? Nail salons doing transactions in the middle of the night because they have slave labor there, and they're forcing them to buy deodorant at $10 a pop, to keep them in slavery longer, and how banking has been on the forefront of trying to stop this. Nobody, but as soon as you put it in the ESG format, everybody's like, oh, why do you want to, be intrusive in my life? And I'm like, well, no, it's the same idea. It's just plugging.
It's often the same thing.
Governance on top. What's that?
It's often the same thing.
It's the same thing. Governance. What's wrong with governance, right? What's wrong with being responsible about the environment? And that's what Rob and I are trying to say, is stop politicizing this, stop posturing on some of this. Nobody's saying shut down, all oil tomorrow. Nobody's saying, some of this is going to take time to gradually, wean ourselves off of this and move to a better innovative solution, right? We're not fueling our our homes with whale oil anymore, right? At one point we were, and now we're not. And there had to be some type of push to transition. And so
Or
it
wood.
what's that?
Or wood.
Or
Quick
wood,
side
yeah.
note,
And so
do you know what Play-Doh was originally?
no.
When you had old houses that were fueled by wood, like I think till 1904 roughly,
Uh-huh.
there was this residue that would form on the walls, and Play-Doh was invented to take it off the walls. And when
Oh,
we stopped
Oh,
using
no
wood, they
kidding.
were like, "Oh, well, we've got this product that has no use anymore. How can we pivot?"
interesting. See,
Oh,
innovation. There you go.
innovation. I mean, who ate Play-Doh when they were kids?
When they were kids, I had it for breakfast.
Yeah, I know I think that's what we're trying to do here. So this is helpful to understand just how complicated, but how progress is being made. I think
Yeah,
we need to
too.
show that progress is being made on such a complex topic. So yeah, it's been great to get your feedback on that.
I agree, Nate. As always, wonderful episode. I mean, we're killing it, obviously. Um, Terry, thank you so much. That was really, really good. This paper is really, really good. Everyone watching this, go to the link below, download the paper. We will be updating this fairly regularly as changes come in, and
We'll
they
be
are
updating
coming
it
in.
soon.
Yeah,
Very
probably. No
soon.
kidding. Well, go to Japan first. Enjoy your trip. I'll bother you again when you get back.
Yeah,
Thank you
enjoy
both.
Japan. Absolutely.
It was fun. It was great fun. Enjoyed it. Thanks for having me.
Oh, we've got to get you back on. There's lots of topics to discuss, and we've hit our stride. We're rolling with every Friday now. So I'm looking forward to the next one. But in the meantime, everyone, communications@owlesg.com, questions, comments, feedback, critiques, guest suggestions, you want to be on, send your reason. I'm Rob Yates, Director of Communications, thanking Nate again, and Terry, of course, thank you for being on, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day.
Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye.